All right, let's go ahead and get started with second part of memory, our unit on memory. So the slide in front of you, excuse me, says overview, and we already looked at the basic introduction to memory, types of memory, and then we said, well, there's working memory, semantic memory, episodic memory, and then collective memory. The second part, we want to look at stages of memory. And you see before you encoding, we want to talk about first, storage, and then retrieval, and then a little bit at the end says putting it all together. So basically, three sections here about the stages of memory. You know, in other words, there's a certain process, stage one, stage two, stage three, to speak in general terms, encoding, storage, and retrieval. So let's see where this takes us today. First slide. Encoding, then the initial experience of perceiving and learning events. Perceiving and learning events, that's the total process. So this is just the initial experience, or what we could call the process of encoding. So encoding occurs during our initial exposure to information, and usually happens automatically. Does not mean that everything we experience is necessarily encoded and retained for the long term, although this is kind of an interesting thing to think through, you know, how much of what you experience actually remains with you, whether you can recall it or not. But that's an interesting thing to roll around in your brain about. Routine occurrences, for example, don't make as strong of an impression as unique occurrences. So our memories are constantly making rapid fire calculations about the relative importance of the information coming in and what to encode. You know, so you're just walking through your day, not realizing that all these things are firing at you, and you're experiencing all this, and your mind's processing all this stuff, and somehow there's a bit of a filtering device in there that the same people could be experiencing the same thing but walk away with different memories. Why? Because some are more routine. There might be something unique in that to some, more routine, and others. Other people say, well, that's important, and somehow it is retained, and others it isn't, or so we think. So encoding, then, I guess what we're saying, it's selective, right? So it's the beginning of this memory, learning memory process, but it's a selective process. You pay attention to some events in your environment, and then you ignore others, right? Maybe you're not aware that you're doing it, you know, really. But if something happens that seems strange, like during your walk to class, you discover a giraffe in front of the library. So you try to figure out what's going on. You'll likely investigate to some degree, but then you might just find out from some others that, well, you know, there's some zoo promotion going on here, you know, whatever, some zoo in the Adirondacks, and here's a giraffe, you know, standing there to promote it. Following a typical walk across campus, you're likely to be able to recall events reasonably well in the short term, you know, like if they happened in the last 10, 15 minutes or so. But if asked, you could say who you bumped into, what the weather was like, so on, you know. But if someone were to ask you to recall this particular walk a month later, you'd hardly be expected to remember any of it. So nothing significant happened to make strong impression on your memory enough in that short walk that it would stand out. So we could say, well, the encoding didn't stick. And now a giraffe, however, that would stick in your mind for a long time, maybe even for a lifetime. Now I often tell students that you know, especially at the early part of the semester, if I have a whole bunch of young people in the classroom, I really struggle. As much as I can remember some things, I really struggle with names. I don't know, you know, if you can relate, but I have a difficult time. My wife, on the other hand, is just excellent at that. I can remember, pastoring churches all these years, and let's say a family of 5 would show up. Here's mom and dad and 3 little kids. My wife, just meeting them once, she will remember their names, right down to the kids' names. It's just amazing to me. I'm so impressed with that. I struggle with that. It's probably just a bit of laziness on my part and a bit of inattentiveness on my part, that I'm just so caprice and careless about name recall. But somehow the encoding, so I often tell students, well, you've got to just do something outrageous, to get my attention, somehow. And then I'll remember your name. But it's a strange process, and I don't guarantee it. But that's the idea of encoding and getting encoding to stick then. Something happens that stands out, that's not just ordinary, doesn't just blend into the surroundings, but is special to you, and you encode it. Let's talk about just distinctiveness for a moment. So there's somebody with a Canon, a Canon camera, I should say, and focusing the lens just a little bit there. So this is basically an illustration about the function of distinctiveness as an aid to the encoding process. So distinctiveness describes the principle that universal events are more likely to be recalled and recognized than commonplace, or what we'd say non-distinctive events. Let me say that again. Unusual, maybe I said universal, that's why I want to say this again, so I apologize, but unusual events are more likely to be recalled and recognized than commonplace or non-distinctive events. So the principle even applies to events that are not experienced directly, but learned about secondhand. Now there's a phrase that's associated with this function of distinctiveness as being illustrative of memory. And it's this expression, flashbulb memory. I say flashbulb memory. That's going to make almost no sense to anyone who, wow, how old would you have to be? My age, right? To remember flashbulb. So it's kind of an archaic term. But it used to be, now if you go way, way back to the old cameras, you'd have this, you'd see in the old films, somebody be taken in to be this large, almost tripod next to this big box of a camera, and they would put some powder in it. It'd be flash powder. And so when you wanted that burst of light when the shutter opened, then there would be some electrical charge or something, and poof, and you remember those, if you ever see those old movies, and boom, here's this big plume of smoke and a flash of light. And so try to harness that into a little flash bulb. And it used to be that you'd have this camera, and Kodak would call them like Instamatic cameras, and the later ones had actually flashes in them, and you put like a battery inside the camera with your 35 millimeter film or whatever it was inside the camera, and then you'd hear this sort of hissing, whining sound as the battery was charging up, and then a little green light would come out and say, okay, you're ready, and then you hit the button, and when you hit the button, the flash would go. But just before those were high tech, those were the really high tech models, the kind with the batteries. But before that, you had what was called a flash bulb. And you could buy a whole bunch of these bulbs, and they were just, one and done. So you put the flash in, you take the picture, poof, it comes out, and out goes the bulb. You got to have another one for the next picture. Then, this is the whole history of cameras, right? So then Kodak, let's say it's Kodak, they come out with another type of flash, and it's this flash cube. And so you put this cube on top of your camera, and then it would have 4 bulbs on it, and so you wouldn't have to keep changing all the time. Yeah, just super, super modern now. And you take your picture, and then it would rotate to the next one, and so on and so on. So there you go. But flashbulb memory then, what is that? How does that relate to this sort of analogy. So it's been used to describe, it is the term flashbulb memory, but used to describe the moment that people receive significant news, and that seems to etch into their memory with great clarity. So just like a flashbulb, poof, here goes the brilliant burst of light. And if you're the one that the picture is being taken, then your eyes might blink or something. You just sort of remember it. And that's the idea here. What is that sort of event? What is it that triggers that, such that it sticks? Let's just use that term. That's a real psychological term, right? So that it just sticks in your memory. In other words, the encoding takes place and it stays there. I can think of some things, so I remember, this isn't a very pleasant memory, but I can remember going to Bible school in Dallas, and we just put the kids to bed, and my wife and I were just getting ready for bed. I think we actually did turn in, and I think it was somehow between midnight, 2 a.m., but it was just seemed like the middle of the night to us that the phone went off. The phone was next to the bed, and the phone rang. And we thought, this is unusual. Turned the light on, sat straight up in bed, picked up, and when you get a call at that hour, if it's a wrong number, crank call, something like that. But really, this is could be serious. So we thought it was a family member or something, and picked it up, and it was one of my classmates at school, and they just said these 3 words: Jeff is dead. Jeff was another one of our fellow students. He was a single student, but he was about my age at that time, mid-20s, and he and I had just probably the closest relationship he had with me than he had with anybody else, I suppose, because Jeff was sort of to himself. He's sort of unique, a bit eccentric, and I only found out later that he suffered from bipolar disorder, and would be on and off his medications. He really loved the Lord, had a heart for evangelism, was there studying to be an evangelist. So we had a lot of things in common that sort of brought us together. And yet, Jeff, but I can tell you, so we're talking about flashbulb memory and clarity, right? So why am I telling you this? It's because I can remember it. I can remember it with great clarity. I can't tell you precisely the time, but I can remember it was a telephone call. My wife and I had already gone to bed. We were in Plano, Texas, where we lived, and actually Garland. Sorry, we're in Garland, Texas, actually where we live, which is near Mesquite. And Jeff was from West Monroe, Louisiana. So how do I remember that? How do I remember Jeff was from West Monroe, Louisiana? I really didn't know that until the time of the funeral. Of course, that isn't associated with the phone call, but till the time of the funeral, when his dad was the pastor of the church. And I didn't know Jeff was a pastor's kid. Didn't know that until this time. And made the way out from Dallas, Texas, the long drive across the state and then into Louisiana, to West Monroe, Louisiana, to this funeral. And the fellow actually that called, he and his wife went with Sally and I, and off we went. It's those types of things that are just vivid, and you have them as well. I mean, you can recall with great clarity these events. So you may not get every detail right, and the more you recall it, as we'll look at in a moment, the more you recall these things, and sometimes little things can get added, little more detail than, it's sort of like somebody who paints a picture and it's really fine the way it is, and then you sort of, every time you take it out and display it, you just got to put a couple more touches in it here and there. So somehow our memories aren't perfect, but the fact of whether or not the event took place, so that sticks pretty strongly. Now, one question that sometimes is asked, with regard to memories of more group things, let's say, where we talk maybe about collective memory. Remember that collective, like a collective flashbulb moment. A collective memory is something that maybe an entire group, like something that happened on campus, and everybody's aware of it, and everybody witnessed it. You might have been, at a basketball game or something, or at a soccer game, and you all sort of viewed it together, and it just became a common experience. But on a broader, more global or even national scale, if you're a baby boomer, which you're not, but I am, I'm really at the tail. It's like baby boomers are like 1945 to 1964. If you were born so I was born in 1960, so I qualify. I'm one of those baby boomers. And the question might be, hey, where were you when? Where were you when this happened? Where were you when John F. Kennedy was shot? Well, I can't really claim to be able to answer that. I mean, that was November 22nd, 1963. I was about 2 months into my 4th year at that point. I couldn't tell you. I couldn't tell you except by cheating through the history books. But still, those folks that were born about 10 years or more earlier and something like that could tell you, because it just rocked the world. For example, if you Google that, of course he was shot in Dallas, Texas, and if you just Google that, you could just see what a dramatic national event. Obviously, he was our president. But if you were to ask me, okay, about 9/11, now 9/11 was 2001, so that's 19 years ago, and so not sure how old you guys are, but you're going to be around that same age I was when Kennedy was shot relative to this. But I can remember this vividly, 9/11, 2001, just brilliant, sunny, gorgeous, late summer day, just absolutely beautiful. Walked across the street to my office at the church, which was upstairs. Took my seat there like I usually do, and I can remember my wife calling and saying we're under attack. I mean, she wasn't shrieking or something, but she was just saying, yeah, and the radio was saying, the local radio station, which would be like WGY, which you'd know that if you're up in Powdersville, but like, here's WGY coming out of Albany, something like that. Say, hey, we're under attack, and immediately I said, what are you talking about? So I came out of the office, went down across the street, and right when the first of the trade towers was coming down. So I can. Usually you'd say, well, can you remember what you were doing at the time? I certainly can. Can you remember what you were wearing? No, I can't remember that. Can you remember the room or place? Yeah, I can remember the room, and so on. Can you remember what you were doing the day before? And no, not really. So there's a lot of things, but yet what anchors me to that event was things like the place, and so for some people it's like I was wearing this, or for some people I had just finished doing that or something. There's certain things that you associate with it, but distinctiveness, is important. So we've talked about encoding, and wow, there's now that woman's name is Phyllis Diller. You wouldn't know her. I think she passed away not long ago. She was a comedian. Well, can you imagine? She was a comedian, right? So she looks like she would be a comedian, always known for wearing these crazy flamboyant things and acting wildly. But so we want to look at recoding and what in the world that means. Of course, it says they're taking information from one form and converting it in a way that makes sense to us. Taking information from one form, this is of course technically describing it, converting it into a way that makes sense to us. And you see how this is laid out. The bold. Well, no, you don't, because I haven't clicked it. The bold red, PEMDAS. So if you wanted to remember this phrase, and we'll tie this in context in just a moment. Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, right? And so you see Phyllis Diller over there. I imagine she's Aunt Sally, but please excuse my dear. If you wanted to remember that phrase, I don't know why you would, but if you wanted to, then you might take the first letter, like as a mnemonic device, right? So we get used to that expression. A memory aiding device, that's what a mnemonic device is. And I've given you just a few of them, and we've looked at a few of them. But then one might be this. Well, how about if I just remember PEMDAS? Now that was sort of a way that I used to study for quizzes and some essay questions and things like this, that I had to recall like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So here this would be 6 different things you want to recall. Maybe in order, maybe not in order, but you just had to get those 6 things. Now, each one of these may represent a sentence, or they might represent a point and an outline, which is how I used to do it. So I'd say, okay, so I would take all of the lectures up to that unit, and they would be all outlined. And so if I could remember the points of the outline, then I could go back and say with each point, like the first one that began with P, and then I could remember the content in between, but I had to sort of have these indicator words along the way. So it's just like recoding, which takes place during encoding, and that's what we want to look at a little bit. So we talked about encoding, distinctiveness, and so we don't want to say that this is something different from encoding, but it's something that takes place during encoding. So encoding, recoding. Recoding then is what? It's our memory's way of making associations between the new information and things we already know. So you already have this bank of knowledge, and you want to try to remember something new, but you do it by associating with something that you already know. That's the idea of recoding. So these associations then, by doing this, they become the framework for our ability to retrieve that information, which is what I was just describing. Now it might be that I take something that I know, like I actually label, I create a label for information. And then the new information is contained under that label, but I associate the two. So it's really a deliberate act to develop, to improve retention, which is what you want. Now my thing was I could retain information, but not forever. And so you've heard of people cramming for exams, maybe. So, you'd come to the midterm of the semester, and it'd be midterm time. But if you had to take 5 midterms, I mean, it's brutal, because you're trying to cram all that into your head, so to speak. But you're trying to find every way to retain that information, and just like they call it cramming right up to the moment. You see students, right, and they're in the classroom, and the professor's getting ready to hand out the exam, and they're still looking at cards, they're still looking at this or something, just to cram that last little bit. But you're really not going to retain it that long, are you? You're going to dump it out, so to speak, onto that exam, and then you're going to move on and probably forget most of that. So we're not claiming, we're just claiming that this is a way to retain or improve retention, but it may not be the best way to ensure long-term learning, application to life, those kinds of things, which generally take what's called habituation, where you continue to go over it, you continue to apply, you continue to do, you continue to reinforce, stuff like that. So here's this PEMDAS that you see in front of you. Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. Let's just see if we can't try something here where we take. If you could remember that, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. And when you do, then you're saying, well, each of those letters then, see, each one becomes a label. Please is going to be a label for new information, but it's going to be the P. That's why it's in red. It's going to be the P, but instead of, do you think it's easier to remember, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, or to remember PEMDAS? Especially when PEMDAS is not an acronym. It's not an actual word. So it's really clumsy. But you can something silly, especially if you have a picture. You may not even need it. You may just have to carry that picture around. Say, oh yeah, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. So what are you trying to remember? So that's the information that you know, but now you want to associate it with something that you don't know. So let's say you're in a math class, and you want to remember, in solving these complex equations, what's the order of operations, in other words, in a mathematical equation? What is the order in solving it? So, you start with what's inside the P or the parenthesis. So you start with parenthesis, then the exponents. That's the E. Then multiplication, M, division, D, addition, A, and subtraction. So imagine you're trying to learn that. Parenthesis, exponents, multiplication, division, addition, subtraction. And there you are, in front of you is this complex math problem, and you're saying, yeah, but I don't know. What do I... Oh, let's see. Let me do the division first. No, that's not it. No, you do it makes sense. Do the addition and subtraction first, because there's all kinds of possibilities. But mathematically speaking, if you want to come to the right answer, you better do the operations in the correct order. And so you start within the parenthesis. And so you're saying, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. So you're saying parenthesis, exponents, multiplication, division, addition, and subtraction. So there are many recoding strategies that can be used during study to improve retention. So two key techniques are, first, think of the meaning of the events and then try to relate them to information that you already know. And then second, try to picture the information in vivid images, including verbal information. So there are just different ways, but just notice what you're doing is you're there's a relationship, right? You're associating new information with information that is already known. New information that you want to retain, that you want to become later on, information that you already know. Now, this whole kind of imagery or imagining things, the second one, we try to picture information in vivid images. This is how, remember this Simon Reinhard? Simon Reinhard was a guy that we talked about last time. When we say, well, hey, if I read out to you six digits, 6 numbers, could you retain them? And most people couldn't. We said, with the telephone number, there's 7, and you can retain that. But this guy, 240, read aloud at 1 second intervals, so quite amazing. And we'll talk about this a little bit later, just kind of how he did that. But this is what he did. He had images for all of these numbers. It's just incredible. But this, again, is something he worked on for years and years and years and years, specific to remembering digits and numbers and having that type of retention. Well, how about if we change and we use an acronym? Because I mentioned that word before. An acronym would be an actual word. So let's take the actual word home, and then let's make it plural. Homes, H-O-M-E-S, homes. And what are you trying to remember? Well, you're trying to remember the names of the Great Lakes. Huron, Ontario, Michigan, Erie, Superior. Now, this is unlike the math one. It doesn't really matter what order they're in, but still, if you want to know them in any kind of order, but especially just to know them, you put them in this order because you have an acronym, H-O-M-E-S. So if you can remember homes, you can remember Huron, Ontario, Michigan, Erie, and Superior. Now there's another one that you could use, and that's the word ocean, O-C-E-A-N, right? Ocean. And so for those who would maybe want to know like what's 5-factor personality theory, for example, when you get into personality theories, what would 5-factor personality theory be? Openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Stay away from that one. neuroticism. So anyway, you get the idea. Acronyms, they can really help. And because you just sort of derive a word and then you locate something new that you want to retain, and this can be used in sermon preparation. As a matter of fact, you can have an acronym. Let's say there's 5 things that you want to talk about, and you create this word. And so if you want to preach without notes, this is what you do. I call it like signposting. I call it signposting. And sometimes it's not an acronym though. It's usually just different words. And so I might have, you could do all of your, you could reduce all of your sermon preparation into maybe 3 or 4 words. Just do that. 3 or 4 words, and those are your signposts. So I'm going to talk about that. And then in your brain you're unpacking that. In terms of, so it's almost like you're photographing. You take a piece of paper and you have now, really, so you have, for example, Charles Spurgeon. You've heard of him, the old preacher from London back in the 1800s, right? A Baptist preacher. And Spurgeon would take an envelope, and the glued seams on an envelope. Would he pull it apart? And here's this part goes up here, this part goes down there, and the 2 wings come out to the side. In the middle, he would put the body of his message, what he wanted to say. And this guy, just look at the metropolitan. Next time you're in the library, pull the one volume. I'm sure that these texts, but there's like 50 some volumes of this. The Metropolitan Tabernacle Library is what it's called, and each one is filled verbatim with his sermons. You pull this out, and you'll see just how long his sermons were. But in the middle of this envelope would be the body, that is to say, the main substance of what he wanted to say. And a little outline of that. The top flap is the introduction, the bottom flap the conclusion, and either side are illustrations that he would use. So try it sometime. Take an envelope, and if you really want to get all analog and non-digital, and your goal was to preach without notes, then take all of your preparation, all of your study, and stick it on an envelope like that, and then take a picture of it with your mind. And I'm not talking about a photographic memory, but you take a look at that, and then you can remember, okay, what do I want to do now? Here's the introduction, and then here are the main elements, and so on and so forth. Yep, that's lots of interesting stuff there. Forming associations and making inferences can happen without our awareness. This is one reason why people sometimes remember false events or details. Now, you're going to have a video assignment that's going to be basically that, sort of a notable psychologist talking about, I'd say false events, but remembering something wrongly or misinformation. She has some techniques that are really not ethical in my mind, but I still wanted you to see it and just have your own assessment of it. But during the process of recoding, the events they're added unintentionally. Then somehow in your recollection, you or really I should say, during recoding. You are making associations with things that you're actually then adding in at some point. So I kind of have to explain that. I'm doing so unintentionally. So one common phenomenon is called the DRM effect, or the Diess-Roediger-McDermott DRM effect, whereby assumptions made about a circumstance, something that happens, become encoded as part of the actual experience. For example, subjects are given an oral presentation of a list. Let's say somebody is saying, listen, I'm going to give you a list, and then I want you afterwards to tell me what you recall from what you heard. And they use these terms: bed, rest, awake, snooze, blanket, doze, slumber, snore, yawn, drowsy. So they just give those words. They announce those. They say, okay, Now tell me what you heard. And so when the subjects, the participants, are asked to recall, they will add a term that was absent from the list but related to the list. In other words, like sleep, and claim that they heard it. I mean, they would just swear that they've heard it. And so this is what's considered to be the DRM effect, and considered to be as well a false memory. Okay, so much for encoding, and you see how that we're just sort of touching the surface of these things, but it can be quite interesting to dig a little deeper in this. So we want to do now storage. So encoding and then storage. Click memory trace. This becomes important. Trace of memory or memory trace. What sticks in there? Engram, as it says. The change in the nervous system that represents our experience. All a little kind of ethereal here and iffy, but nonetheless purportedly scientific, right? So what would a memory trace be in essence? Every experience we have actually had, let's say, alters our brains. To encode our experience, they must be represented in the nervous system, so they change it somehow, leaving what are called like memory traces or engrams. Yeah, who knows, right? But this is the theory, or this is the idea. I don't know if you can dissect the brain and point to an engram, but nonetheless, the exact nature of the neurological change is hard to discern by psychological means alone. This is more inferential, right? The fact that you can remember something and the fact that memory is associated with neurological activity is associated with the brain's, ergo, something must have happened in your brain to change it some way to leave a trace of memory behind. So it's easy enough to understand. It's probably a little bit more difficult to prove. Let's click. So consolidation, or the neural changes that occur over time to create the memory trace of an experience. So events create, now so the theory, I'm just going to call it a theory, but so the theory goes, events create engrams through a process of consolidation of the neural changes that occur over time. So in other words, a recollection of an event relies not only on the details of the event itself, but on the associations involved in its encoding and the memory trace created by all those elements together. So kind of like a compilation of all of these things consolidate into neural changes that create memory traces. So the theory goes, right? So it would be important to ensure that you understand what a memory trace is not. Specifically, a memory trace is not packets of dormant information waiting to be called forward to give an accurate report of the past, like video recordings that are just there waiting to be played. Rather, remembering is often imprecise and fraught with error. Memory, and maybe we should just say remembering in this case, it's reconstructive. It's a formation of memory traces and knowledge of what we think happened in the past. It's our best assessment of that. Now I realize that if you're like me, and you're absolutely sure it happened, and it happened that way, Now that might hold if you were the only person there, and you were, in the woods by yourself, and you saw something or heard something. But it's interesting how different people can, as we mentioned earlier in the encoding thing, different people can isolate things that other people wouldn't. and given the fact that we could add certain other elements in. So you see the image there in front of you is this image of pottery fragments, which might serve as a helpful device for us to remember the concept of a memory trace. In other words, here's all these fragments. This is what they would have us to believe are all these traces that then are somehow, I guess we're using the not saying the mind, but we're saying specifically the brain, because we're attaching this to neurological activity, right? So we're saying that this is like it is. What I see in that is what I used to bring back is cheap souvenirs from the Sahara, you get out there in the Sahara and you start digging around, and you're going to find all kinds of this what you call shards of pottery, and I would take a little bag and put them in there and bring them home, and I still have bags of these things. Not a lot, but just say, wow, I found this in the Sahara. Of course, you'd have to believe me, because I could just as easily found it in the backyard, some terracotta plant, planter that broke. But see, the pottery is so fragile that when you'd have the salt-laden camels and their Arab drivers hauling across the Sahara, many of these things are going to be dropped off and broken. Anyway, not that that's a big important thing, but that's what we would have you think about the brain's ability to store this. So encoding, storage, and just another little description here of the storage process. So on the one hand, learning. On the other hand, you have testing, and in between the retention interval. So this could be interesting, considering the concept of retention and retention interval. So much of the memory's integrity is dependent upon the retention interval. What do we mean by integrity? We mean, are you recalling precisely what happened, or close approximation of it, or is your recollection completely off, impaired in some way? So that's what we're talking about, the integrity of it. The retention interval is the time, if it's an interval, it's measurable, it's the time between learning and testing. So you see those at opposite ends, learning and testing. And this is when the memory is highly vulnerable to retention error. And so learning would be somebody in a classroom instructing you. Testing would be when you're asked to recall. But learning can also be something that you experience, and then later on when you want to recall it, and when you're asked to recall it. So what happens in between, or the retention interval? There are certain processes that could either enhance this or take away from it. And what might those be? Well, a couple of them. One would be what's called retroactive interference. Retroactive interference. And the other is called proactive interference. So retroactive and proactive interference. So what do we mean by either of those? Well, the first, retroactive interference. This occurs when activities within the retention interval interfere with a memory. Okay, so one type of retroactive interval, and what did we say that was? Activities within the retention interval interfere. That is within. So when you look at that black with the red lettering, when something happens within that, within that period of time to interfere, that's retroactive interference. One type of retroactive interference is the misinformation effect, which is a phenomenon whereby the memory for an event can be changed via misinformation supplied or added during the retention interval. So when more recent information, that is, that is similar in format gets in the way of information that someone is trying to recall. So for example, you call your ex-girlfriend by your new girlfriend's name. You know, it's a classic. I don't recommend doing this, but it's a classic example of doing that when more recent information, the new girlfriend and her name, but it's similar in format because you're associating it with a person that shares that same relationship now, although a different person, and it becomes exchanged like that. So that's an idea of retroactive interference. You say, "Whoa, that's a slip of the tongue." Well, that's how we might say it, but in essence, this is what's happening in your mind quite often in terms of memory. This is the misinformation effect, something like that. But then there's proactive interference. This occurs when activities before the retention interval even begins, that interfere with memory. So what would something like that be? This would be like old information. Old information prevents, not new information this time, but old information prevents the recalling of new information. I mean, think like about a phone number, like your new phone number keeps you from recalling your old phone number, even if you've had it for years and years and years and years. But your new phone number now keeps you from recalling. You can't remember it. Can't remember it because you have the new information in your head. So there's retroactive interference. There's proactive interference, and that has to do as well with storage. So what about retrieval? This last element here, retrieval. And this would be the third stage of learning. So if we had encoding, and then we have storage, and now we have retrieval. It makes sense, you know. Here we experience something, and some of that gets stored, and out of that we retrieve, right? So it makes kind of sense, this process. So retrieval stage of memory is when we call forth. You know, we want to call it forth, we want to draw it up. And this would be relevant information from our storehouse of knowledge, and we want to apply that to present conditions, whether it's the learning and testing type of dichotomy, and we want to recall it. So we encode thousands of memories every day as new memory traces, but most of this information is never retrieved. Rather, it's stored away and remains dormant. So currently, there's no way of knowing how long these memory traces last. Are they dormant forever? Do they disappear over time? It's a mystery. However, much of the information that's not directly retrieved is still useful in that it shapes our knowledge in subtle, unconscious ways. So psychologists have categorized encoded information in two ways. So you have available and accessible, or by available means all the encoded information in our memory, and then accessible is the information that we are now ready to retrieve. So the complication remains that since the memory is not static, available information often fluctuates in and out of accessibility. And this is why sometimes we fail to remember specific details, while the next hour or day the memory is clear. I mean, you struggle to recall, you say, it was just on the tip of my tongue, I knew that, you know, and then all of a sudden, you know, there's this sweeping sense of clarity an hour later, and, you know, an epiphany, you know, and you take the palm of your hand and hit your forehead and say, oh, yeah, that's what it was, and I couldn't recall it before. So oftentimes the most helpful factors for remembering are environmental cues, and these retrieval cues are encoded as part of the memory trace formed with the original experience. So sometimes recalling a datum or a particular fact, something like that, when it was learned, we could say remembered or placed in your memory, when it was learned in association with some event, something that happened, these can be either helpful or a hindrance to remembering. Let's take this one, encoding easy for you to say. Encoding specificity principle. You just have to be more direct. Specificity. Encoding specificity. I almost blew it again. Principle. The general principle that underlies the effectiveness of retrieval codes in the encoding specificity principle. Just clear as a bell there, isn't it? So what would an example be maybe better? So there's a little penguin down there. So here's a very specific animal, very identifiable, can be highly distinct as a retrieval cue. So what memories, for example, if I just put this penguin up there, what do you think of in association with that? You know, seriously. So if we're talking about encoding specificity principle, this notion that you could have some type of cue, in this case the penguin, that could retrieve or be used to retrieve a memory. So what kind of a memory, gets retrieved for that? And so some of you might think of, well, how about some movie? Some movie like Happy Feet, something like that. I have no idea. But like Happy Feet, I think I vaguely remember this. But that wouldn't be the one I associate with a penguin. No. Wouldn't associate that. Or maybe you'd say, well, hey, when I was a kid, I went to a zoo. I saw a penguin for the first time. Something like that. And it stands out. And not just in general, but it really does. Maybe your parents took you to the zoo, something like that. Okay, so what about me? I see a penguin. It doesn't have to be that penguin, but if I hear penguin, see penguin, my mind goes to the old Batman series. We're talking black and white television from the 60s. And I can remember as a kid growing up and seeing shows like Batman, the Addams Family, the Munsters. These are all the old black and white shows. Well, the Batman series, you want to listen, if you ever want your what do you want to say? Your good common sense to be assaulted. Just watch it. It's just it makes no sense. It's just crazy. Of course, it was for kids, right? But the penguin was played by Burgess Meredith, right? The penguin was played by not the modern day Batman, the Marvel. Is it Marvel or is it DC Comics? I don't know, but one of those. It's all serious and kind of gothic, and the last one with the Joker was extremely, it was. Okay, so anyway, here's the penguin. He was played by Burgess Meredith. Who's Burgess Meredith? But he's the guy that played Mickey. Now, this is still going way back, who was in the Rocky series, all those Rocky movies. But Mickey wasn't. He didn't survive only into about Rocky 3, okay, as an old man. But back in his younger years, right, he played this. But anyway, there you go. That's what retrieves for me. But that's just an example of this encoding, you say it, encoding specificity principle. All right. Let's go to measuring retrieval then. Psychologists can measure memory performance. Guess what? By giving you a test. And you see the student there taking a test. But so what are we saying by what are called production tests? Let me click there. By production tests, then this is the idea of free recall then. So here you go. Let's see what you can recall. Or there are what are called recognition tests, which would be what? Now, I should say production test. Let me just go back there. Production test. It looks like she is actually doing more like a multiple choice, true, false, something. But production would involve free. Now, free recall would be like an essay test. Here's an essay. Never like those, but nonetheless, essay tests basically asking students to remember without any external cues. There's no help except the question. Now you have to remember. Now recognition tests, on the other hand, they can give you some cues, because multiple choice, true, false, something like that, which generally permits greater memory performance, because at least you have some possibilities out there in front of you, especially multiple choice. The correct answer is actually there. And so that cue would be, if you can remember, oh yeah, that word is associated with, right, this type of event or whatever would answer the question. So retrieval has this kind of effect on the memory. So we usually think that retrieval, like, is a neutral act because we implicitly believe that recalling a memory is like taking it off a shelf or then putting it back completely unaltered. But in fact, research shows every time we retrieve a memory, the memory changes. It changes both a positive in terms of a testing effect and negative in terms of retrieval induced kind of forgetting. Just as retrieval practice enhances accurate memories, it can also increase error or false memories, or even cause us to lose some of the less significant factual details, just depending on how we remember something. So let's look at one last thing here, putting it all together, and maybe an example that example or two that will help us. So here, putting it all together, improve your memory, and you see this: 1 is a gun, 2 is a shoe, 3 is a tree, 4 is a door, 5 is knives, 6 is sticks, 7 is oven, 8 is plate, 9 is wine, 10 is hen. So there you go. Probably wouldn't be hard to memorize that, but this is an example of what you call peg word technique for improving the memory. It's just a mnemonic device, like an acronym or something else that we talked about, and it's a trick that's used to remember something, and one such mnemonic device that is somewhat effective for some people. So here's here a list of peg words, things to hang something on, or a peg. It's generally considered easy to memorize. 10 minutes or less, you could probably memorize it. If you can count to 10, you've already memorized that. And if you know what is, that you can memorize that. So you have to remember is gun, shoe, tree, door, knives, and so on, and it sort of rhymes, right? So it's fairly easy to memorize that. So suppose you had to remember a list like bread, peanut butter, bananas, lettuce, and you got it. It's like you're going out to the store, you're doing some shopping, and you say, no, I don't need to write it down, I'll memorize it. So the way to use the method is to form a vivid image of what you want to remember and imagine it interacting with all of your peg words. So you might remember a gun shooting a loaf of, to me this is kind of stupid, but sorry, I just have to say that. I only say that because I wouldn't do it, but apparently somebody has, because there's a slide in front of us. So, like a gun shooting a loaf of bread. Now maybe that sticks in your head, ooh, I just rhymed. So maybe that sticks in your head and it's easy to remember, or a jar of peanut butter inside a shoe. Yeah, not so much. How would you remember, like, places to go, while running errands? This is mostly me, because I'm not going to write anything down. So I'm thinking, okay, I've got to go around town. I've got to go to the bank. I've got to go to the post office. I've got to go to Walmart, and I've got to go to CVS, right? So let's just say I have to go to those places, and now I want to go in a particular order. Going to start out with a car. I'm going to go boom, 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 boom like this. But all I have to remember really is bank, post office, Walmart, CVS. But then, when you get my age, you walk into Walmart and says, why am I here? What am I in here to buy? But let's just say you're not my age and you have a better memory. but usually then I associate certain things that I do at the bank. So I know what I'm doing when I go in the bank. I know the post office, I need to do this. I know at Walmart I need to get, and then I have sort of another list in my head, a little thing, like that. And I know there's certain things. So I'm associating certain things that I do. I'm associating what with where, Now I could just as soon make a list of the whats, right? But I have a lot more whats than I have wheres, right? So bank, post office, Walmart, CVS, and then I have a bunch of whats underneath each of those. And so it's easier for me just to remember, okay, I'm here, and when I walk in, I'm here to do that, something like that. But anyway, that's just a way of a peg word technique, that isn't as exciting as the one as a gun thing, I'm sure. But nonetheless, it works. But it's an example of how that functions. One last thing. Here you go. Disney World or Disneyland? I don't know. One or the other, right? There are many techniques then for improving memory using mnemonic devices. All involve forming distinctive encoding operations and then having an infallible set of memory cues. That is to say, when you associate with what you want to recall, really, and then it becomes infallible. It's important to note that developing and using these memory systems beyond the PEG system takes a great amount of time and concentration. But for most common purposes, just keep in mind that to remember well, you need to encode information in a distinctive way and to have good cues for retrieval. Now granted, some things are more important than others. My shopping list or my errands are not nearly as important as other things that you would want to recall. So earlier, the last lecture we were talking about this Simon Reinhardt and this amazing thing, 240 numbers, not just single digits, but 240 numbers that did in as many seconds, and not using a visual cue, but just hearing them. Okay, so how did this happen? So he has a much more complex system on these same principles. In his case, he uses memory palaces. Remember, I had mentioned Sherlock Holmes and his mind palace, and how I used to create little rooms in there every semester with 5 rooms, 5 different courses. Of course, I'd have to clean them out every time, and make room for more stuff. But in his case, he uses these memory palettes. These are elaborate mental settings combined with huge sets of images for digits. And I remember he did this over a course of a decade, right? But he memorized a set of 10,000 images for remembering digits in combination with hundreds of memory palaces, like his childhood home, for example. So every 4-digit number for him immediately would evoke a mental image. So, for example, the number 6180, this is Reinhardt, the number 6187 might be Michael Jackson, something like that. And so when Simon hears all the numbers coming at him, he places an image of every 4 digits into the places in his memory palace. And he can do this at an incredibly rapid rate of faster than 4 digits for 4 seconds. So it's amazing. So let's think a little bit differently on this, because you're thinking, well, I really don't want to do that, but what it could be useful for you. So how about this? How about, and this is so helpful if you really want to be a preacher, and we talked about preaching without notes ever so briefly, but signposting your message. What about this? You could use this type of technique with the contents of the Bible. So you have 66, let's say you have 66 rooms, with each room containing the main sections of each book. So each room would be then, this is a mansion, right? 60, but then what do we have up in front of you? We got a big palace in front of you, but 66 rooms. So let's just say Genesis, for example. All you need to know is here's Genesis, open the door, what's in there? Creation, fall, flood, patriarchs, right? And so imagine doing this with each book of the Bible, you know? And then I would have to just say that, you know, you divide it by chapters. You could do that, but at least thematically. What if you did that thematically for every book? So you open up the door for every book of the Bible, and you're able just to recall that's what's in this book. So you say, well, that's too hard. No, I'm not going to do that. That's too hard. It would be good, though, to know every chapter of the Bible and what's in every chapter. That could be interesting. How about this? How about we simplify it? How about we just say Old Testament, and I ask you to just remember 5 numbers: 5, 12, 5, 12, 5. You know, can you remember that? 5, 12, 5, 12, 5. So 5 books of law, 12 books of history, 5 books of poetry, wisdom, you know, like that. 12 books of the minor prophets, 5 books of the major prophets. So that would be easy. I don't know what you do with that, but you could put one way to remember. But you see, if you could retain the law, history, poetry, whatever, and then said underneath of that. Now I've done this teaching at SUNY, where I've taught through the Old Testament, and I basically have it divided up into 7 epical sections, and just from my memory and a whiteboard, and I'll draw 7 different categories across the whiteboard with a class in front of me, and start talking from not so much book by book, but in chronological order of the history of the Jews, namely from prior, you know, as creation and those events, and on through the end of the written Old Testament, or the Torah, the Hebrew writings. So I just encourage you in the area of memory, in the area of retention, that you say, you know, I can't remember, I can't recall. You know, I've said all that myself, you know, oftentimes. But I would say find some type of a mnemonic device that works for you, and make a bit of a game out of it. But just don't set, you know, the bar so high that you get discouraged. But maybe just say, you know, to begin to work on that. For me, it was memorizing scripture, and I began working on that a little bit. But then there were other things that I wanted to retain, and just begin doing that. Begin trying it, and begin seeing, you know, what you can do and do effectively.